Forward, and this is kind of what I wanted to talk about in the book, is you don't need to worry about Russian influence or disinformation or Russian active measures. You need to worry about American active measures, American political campaigns, public relations groups, global oligarchs with enough resources to acquire a social media space. Even celebrities will use this system to change reality, to change it in a different way. The first sort of fears of this came from this guy, Eli Pariser. He wrote a book called The Filter Bubble. And it was basically that you are only getting a version of the world based on the filter of a Google search engine. I offer you that now in social media, it's preference bubbles. It's not all the fault of the social media companies. You pick what you like on there, and they deliver more of what you like. And whether you realize it or not, that is an artificial reality created only by you. When you look at your phone or your computer and you're looking through social media, that is a world specifically created for you, and it is not real. It has been tailored to make you feel happy so that you'll buy things, which you may or may not need, or you may have talked about wanting, but didn't realize you wanted that badly, right? Everyone's gotten the creepy ads if you use social media. That's because they also know what you discuss with your friends, even in physical conversations, or your mom looks up something and your father and your friend look it up and they know that it was really a conversation with you. So it's a combination of these two things. And what's most important about it is it plays to all of our biases. The first bias is confirmation bias. It literally is called the like button, because you're saying, I like this, please give me more. Confirmation bias is I want to see more things that confirm what I already believe and what I already like. The second thing is implicit bias. You want information that comes from people that look like you and talk like you. This was the brilliance of the Russian disinfo system. And so when you look at that implicit bias over time, you start trusting your friends as the source of information rather than the actual source of information they are sending you. Your uncle who sends you crazy things on Facebook or by email doesn't know that it's not true or that it's false. They're just trying to share a story that probably confirms what they believe. The third part is what I call digital nations, or social media nations have come up, and this creates digital tribes. And so once you get in a digital tribe, you want to stay there. So even if you don't agree with what the tribe is saying in your digital world, you don't say anything anymore, and you'll stick with the status quo, because it's called the tyranny of majority, right? Once you start drifting out of it, you're likely to get outed from the group or punished. You want to see your retweets go up, and you want to see your likes go up, and you want to see more people share your content. So this is a powerful force, and it had three dynamic changes. This comes from two things. It's one part you, and it's one part the algorithm that is feeding you what you want. The social media companies can try as hard as they want to sort of switch this, but they're just killing their platforms if they do. The platform is built to give you content, to keep you engaged on the content, right? So they can't really solve the whole thing. Really, only the user can solve this. The second, or the first dynamic that I want to talk about is what I call clickbait populism, which is popular content, and those that push it are then rewarded, essentially. Have you heard of anyone running for president that isn't already a celebrity in the last 2 years? Any challenger they talk about in 2020 almost already is a social media celebrity that's out there. The news media runs right with this story. Who cares about their qualifications? Do you know how many followers they have? How big their brand is? The Rock is going to run for president. That has been thrown around for a year because he has a lot of revenue. We don't even know if The Rock wants to run for president. The names that we talk about, it's almost impossible to be a good government servant and rise up through the ranks if you're not out spinning yourself as a social media phenomenon. We could even talk about prison reform. It did not happen or get awareness until a social media celebrity showed up in the White House a couple of weeks ago. This puts a lot of power in the hands of people that know nothing and have never done anything. It's a dangerous phenomenon because we're elevating people that haven't actually served in any of these functions, or haven't actually been business people, or haven't actually been aware of any of these problems. But they will be the ones that can quickly short circuit this entire system. This leads to the second thing, which I call social media nationalism. People now spend anywhere from 3 to 5 hours on their cell phones, young people even more. They're connected virtually with people that are friends and followers more than they are their neighbors in physical relationships. which means their allegiance is as much to a social media nation than it is to a physical nation. This transcends borders. I'll give you the first example of this is ISIS. At a time in Syria and Iraq when thousands and millions of people were fleeing those countries in Syria and Iraq, there were people that believed in the ISIS fantasy on social media so strongly they moved into Syria. Can you imagine being at the Turkish border and seeing 500,000 refugees leaving and a family who's been on social media has convinced themselves from Europe, this is the way to go, marching in, only to get hit by a drone on the other side or an airstrike, or to go to a battlefield named Kobani. Kobani was a religious battlefield concocted in a narrative by the Islamic State of military insignificance. It was worthless, and the ISIS guys died in droves. Their social media nation convinced them this was something significant. Good for us they did, because they got killed and slaughtered on that battlefield, and it's helped out with our foreign fighter problem. This is also playing out today in our own country. People have greater allegiance to their social media nation than they do to their physical nation. They spend more time online than they do in their neighborhoods. And this is a national security problem that I see sort of emerging over the horizon. If you told me someone's a Democrat or a Republican today, that means absolutely nothing to me. I don't even know what that means. But if you tell me what hashtags they use, MAGA or resistance or whatever you want to pick, the 76ers, you can pick anything. You pick any one of those hashtags, I know almost everything they're going to say before they even say it. I know what lines they will repeat. In fact, they'll go on TV and repeat the lines that have been basically fed to them by their social media nation. This is going to be a huge danger for democracies over the horizon, and particularly for young people. Young people are spending more and more time on this, and they value their virtual friendships more than their physical friendships, which means they will turn on their physical friends for a virtual relationship that may or may not be real. Kind of like the guy who called the woman and the man down in Florida at the Cheesecake Factory to show up to do a rally, and one of them still doesn't believe that they got duped, even after the FBI visited them and told them. The last part of this is the death of expertise. This is the belief that anybody who has a connection to the internet is smarter than any other expert in the world on every topic ever. This is particularly ripe with young people today. And why not? You can Google anything, right? You can access lots and lots of information, but it also makes you believe that anyone can sort of accomplish or do anything. Doctors were the first ones to suffer this, and I sort of talk about this in the conclusion of the book. Vaccine conspiracies were rife. I even had to deal with it myself. Why did this come about? Well, I thought I had the power to access so much information, and because I went to college and I'm super smart, surely I can also diagnose any advanced disease in the world at any time. But we tell people that today, that you can figure this out. So the tough part is, when are you an expert and when are you not? You will see with these social media celebrities, this clickbait populism, people rise to the top of the pack who are telling you all sorts of things that are absolutely false, of which they have no knowledge, because in fact, they don't even work, and they might just have a cell phone and a social media account. That is a devastating thing because it's anti-science, it's anti-government, it's anti-authority. It actually makes it impossible to govern the population because everyone thinks they have a better answer, and you can't come to consensus on anything. Ultimately, what I'm worried about, particularly moving forward, is which nation will you spend more time in? Your physical nation or your social media nation? I would tell you right now that if I mapped out the United States, there is no United States. It's actually a series of social media nations that somewhat overlap in places. It has led to preference bubbles that compete with each other. I can demarcate them just like we did with the Russian influence network, or like terrorist, ISIS versus Al-Qaeda, in the same way, just by doing a social media census. They transcend physical borders. So these real world nations, all these things we used to use to identify physical nations, don't hold much weight. Who's going to fight for a flag or for principles or the Constitution when you don't really have to? When the people that you're most concerned about are the people that are sharing your hashtags, your wallpapers, who are looking at you and commenting on what you're saying and what you're doing. Who's got the most fan pages, friends, and followers? That's who you are putting your allegiance to. And if you spend more time in the virtual world, there won't be much of a physical world left, ultimately, in the end. This is particularly damning for democracies. Because on the other end of the world, they're using social media to do what? Create a preference bubble and close it down so that there is no resistance to the actual authoritarians. This is a perfect weapon for authoritarians. It's freedom of choice, it's freedom of preference used against you over time, collectively. So I'll give you two scenarios. I'll give you the worst case scenario first. The worst case scenario is the United States doesn't make it. I'm going to show you a graph here of why this is a possibility that you should consider. During the election, one of the things that kept popping up, and one of the first things that we picked up on, was a petition at the White House website called Alaska Back to Russia. The Russians were hammering it, right? But then came Texas exit and Cal exit. And now California, by the way, what are they doing? They actually have an initiative, a ballot initiative about maybe we want to leave the United States. If preference bubbles continue and continue to harden and separate because our politicians are using them to their advantage to sustain their own power, I would tell you this. If the Democrats win in 2020, don't be surprised if in 2024 or 2028, a major candidate in the United States runs under the auspices of, I will break up the United States of America and create a separate entity. They won't win, but what if they get 5% popular support across the country, or 10? That is devastating to the United States. There's a segment out there right now that is willing to leave if they don't get their way. That could happen. I'm not convinced that it won't happen, even if we stay on our current trajectory. But if there's flip-flop back and forth, one side or the other may say, I'm done with this and it's time to leave. Maybe we should break up. I would tell you, you could go look at the Federalist website, and somebody wrote an article that says, are we ready for a divorce? This has never really been floated in a serious way in our country. It actually has quite a bit of traction out there. I'll tell you the upside. Over the last 2 to 3 years, we've seen more physical activism actually on both ends of the political spectrum than we've ever seen maybe in our nation's history. And you're seeing a revival of people running for office and participating in their governments. This is all good. This is physical nation stuff. This is people actually showing up. So if turnout turns up and we actually see compromise, then things could turn out good. And the phenomenon that you see so far has been catastrophe with social media. Facebook saved the Arab Spring, right? No, it toppled these dictators, and then those who were organized behind the scenes took over. ISIS, what did they do? Social media populism toppled Al-Qaeda, an established jihadi group. If you look back to our last election, you really had social media and ground populism on the Republican side of the camp that toppled the GOP. There's a lot of discussion now, is there a GOP? And I would tell you, moving into the next election cycles, when I watch it just from a social media perspective, you're having the same tidal wave today on the American left. The resistance is likely to topple the Democrats. If you look at what's going on, they're trying to rectify, are we part of one thing or not? And I was on Bill Maher about a month ago, and I said, the resistance is another example. He goes, I thought the resistance were the Democrats. And my answer I was trying to get out in 7 seconds was, I think the resistance is much bigger than the Democrats. So how do these rectify themselves? How do you make the establishment sort of move together and join with the social media populists that are rising up? This is a great snapshot from America. This is The Economist. They always do the best charts, and because they're not Americans, they actually don't get too bogged down in their opinions, right? And they can kind of think through things. This is a chart of the political spectrum in the United States. 1994, what do we know? There's a big center. 2004, basically the same center. Look at 2017. Those bubbles have moved faster than at any time in US history. Those divisions have already been there. This is what the Russians knew. The Russians knew we were divided. They just needed to help us break apart. Turn cracks into chasms. That is a chasm on the right. You can't have policy compromise if you can't work together. If there is no center, there is no United States of America. Bottom line, it doesn't work. You have to be able to agree on something, or ultimately you'll die of 1,000 cuts. Policy and action on 1,000 fronts. What has actually occurred in terms of policy over the last 4 to 5 years? We haven't had a budget, and we've been fighting the global war on terror under the same mandate for how many years now? Deploying all over the world. That's not policy. That's called, what are we going to do today? Let's figure it out later. And that is devastating for democracies. So I hope all of you in here will choose your physical nation. I would tell you there's not many young people in the audience. This is a crowd that probably uses social media a lot less than the voters that are coming up today. It's interesting, 20 years ago, we used to talk about the matrix. You know, when would robots overtake us? When would we get trapped in the matrix? And the truth is, for the young people that are out there today, they won't get trapped in the matrix. They will enlist in the matrix. As long as the temperature stays between 68 and 72 degrees every day, and they can look at a near constant stream of, you know, media and information, they'll be pretty content to let everything else go the way that it will go. And it's not because they're doing anything or neglecting anything or wanting to do anything wrong. It's just that they've spent more time in that virtual nation than they have in the physical nation. And so I think a big part of what we have to do is really figure out how to pave over our divides at our age so that the next generation knows what they need to fight for and what they need to believe in so that they can keep this country going in the future. And on that high note, I will stop and take questions. Thanks, Tom.